Started.
Hello and welcome to Do You See What I See? I'm Yolanda Nava. Today's guest is a professor emeritus and a founding chair of the Chicano Studies Center at UCLA, Reynaldo Macias. Welcome, Reynaldo. It's so good to have you here
About that
today.
spotlighted your video for everyone.
It's been a long
Well,
time since we've
thank you,
seen each
Yolanda.
other. Yes, it's
And
good
just a
to
quick
have you.
correction. I'm
Yes.
founding chair of the UCLA César E. Chávez Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies, not the Research Center. The Research Center was something that was started
Oh,
back
I
in
meant the Chicano studies, but I didn't take the Cesar Chavez in there. Yes, it's the Cesar Chavez Chicano Study Center. Yes. Research
department.
department. Oh, it's a department.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's confusing then. So there are different branches there then of something
Yep,
similar.
yep.
Okay. And how does that differ from the research center?
Well, quick history. The development of Chicano studies, Chicana and Chicano studies, broadly writ, at UCLA was with the establishment of what were then called the Institute of American Cultures and the four research centers that went along with that.
Excuse me, I got to stop us. There's a power mower outside. I've got to close the door.
Pause this. And when you're ready.
I didn't get that thing. All right. Hello and welcome to Do You See What I See? I'm Yolanda Nava. Today's guest is a professor emeritus and the founding chair of the Cesar Chavez Chicano Studies Department, Reynaldo Macias. Welcome, Reynaldo. It's so good to have you here.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Yolanda. Thank you.
You've been at this for a long time. We met at UCLA back in the late 60s, and you remained an academic after I left graduate school. You went off to Georgetown and studied linguistics. What was it that was going on at that time at UCLA and with the people that you met that led you in that direction?
Well, one of the things that I was very much interested in that period of time was languages. And one of the areas that I studied at UCLA in graduate school was I went into the teacher training program, if you will, but also a master's program in early childhood curriculum and instruction. And in the early childhood program, one of the things that I was interested in was child language acquisition, and especially bilingualism, where children learn more than one language from birth. And so the idea of learning more about bilingualism and multilingualism was kind of already there. UCLA only had one course on child language acquisition, and they didn't much focus on bilingualism. And as I began to do my master's thesis, which was on the first bilingual Head Start program in the country, we think, which here in LA, organized by Cecilia Suarez, that I began to understand that there was a whole disciplinary area of the study of multiple languages, and to some extent its relationship to schooling and education. The thing about linguistics is that if you take it strictly as a discipline, it tends to be only focused on language structure and to some extent use, but not much more than that. And in the U.S., with a strong Eurocentric Anglo-American focus, it tends to be concentrated on English in relationship to the schools. So as I got more involved in the linguistics area, after doing my master's thesis on the language attitudes and goals of the parents of the bilingual Head Start that I was involved with, I found out that there was this new area called sociolinguistics, where they focused on the social uses of language and linguistics in relationship to all kinds of things, including educational language policies, national language policies, and different varieties of English even. Much of the early research that developed to form the basis of sociolinguistics was done with African American vernacular English. And so that excited me because it seemed to me to be involved in at least a social, if not political dimension of language and language use that I could deal with in relationship to bilingual education, but also to the alternative schooling that Chicano studies then represented, and that alternative schooling, and particularly alternative bilingual schooling for Chicanos and Chicanas, represented during the movement.
Has left the meeting.
So that was the principal reason.
Well, I remember when I was young, when I was in elementary school and kindergarten, there was very strong bias against speaking Spanish, and we were punished if we spoke Spanish in school. I grew up in Echo Park area, downtown Echo Park area, and we were punished. And I remember that very distinctly. And I backed away from speaking Spanish. I had, of course, learned it, from my first words were in Spanish. And of course, I learned English. Both my parents spoke English, and Spanish. And that kind of tongue-tied me until I went to high school. But you never used conversation at high school or at university Spanish. It was all reading and grammar. And so that bias, I think, is one of the factors that if people have difficulty acquiring a second language here, it might be because of the negative attitudes that surround that instruction in this country, as you mentioned, because of the political and racial biases that exist and the Euro-Anglocentric attitudes that we do have in this country that we've seen highly exacerbated our present times, especially since 2015. The patterns that we have in language and in linguistics, I mean, there's a tremendous potential there for expanding how people learn and discover and understand, and how one creates one's own sense of persona in their uses of language. Mexico doesn't seem to have a problem. The indigenous people learn Spanish, then they learn English, then they learn French. My father spoke 3 languages. That was, literate in 3 languages because he grew up in Mexico, and they still taught French in school then. How does that factor into our situation?
Well, it has only changed in degree, not in kind.
Yes.
And if you go back to the development of public schooling in this country, there is a movement, an English language campaign to make English the exclusive language of instruction in public schools. This goes back into the late, middle 19th century, but is particularly a major campaign during the first quarter of the 20th century. Yeah. And one of the things that I found out in looking at these educational language policies, there was not just a proactive promotion of English, it was also an what then became collectively known as foreign language education movement. And the actual stated objectives of many state and federal government laws and politicians was to have a language shift from mother tongue, non-English languages, including indigenous languages, immigrant languages, and colonial languages, to mother tongue English language acquisition. And the schools were the central pillar in that forced government language shift. So the kind of, if you will, penalties or punishments that kids experienced, especially after the 1920s, when universal schooling really began to expand and into the secondary schools as well. That if you spoke Spanish, whether in the classroom or on the playground or in other places, you were sometimes severely punished, including having people's mouths washed out with soap and all kinds of other things. And if we look at the recent decision of the Supreme Court that approved the multi-factor identification of undocumented, potentially or probably undocumented individuals in this country, then use of the Spanish language was one of the three characteristics: dress and what was the third one? I think it was behavior or something like that.
Interesting.
Or location that was allowed by the Supreme Court for ICE and other law enforcement agencies to use as an indicator for targeting people. So even now, if you speak Spanish publicly, it could put you in severe danger.
Yes, yes. It's really almost antithetical to what's really going on globally, where the world is getting smaller. People are traveling from one continent to the other. When I went to language school to study Spanish, I've gone both to Mexico and to Costa Rica. When I was in Costa Rica, there were people from Germany and all over the world that were there to study Spanish because they believe in multilingualism in Europe. I mean, their countries are all so close. They all speak 3, maybe 4 or 5 languages. I dated a man that spoke 5 languages, and he also learned Spanish once he came to this country because he was going to be a doctor and he wanted to have, the facility to have, serve all patients. It's fascinating how backwards we have been, and it's accelerated, certainly in the last 10 years. Off and on, and it's very disconcerting, to say the least. Let's talk about ethnic studies, because that's been a big important program. It's just celebrated 50 years last October at San Francisco State University. They had a commemorative anniversary luncheon to acknowledge the 50 years of ethnic studies. What are the advantages of ethnic studies, and are they in jeopardy now, even as Jose Medina had legislation passed a couple of years ago, and it was signed by Governor Newsom to have ethnic studies required as a graduation requirement in order to have your diploma from high school.
Right.
What's the status of that now?
Well, there are 2 questions there. One is ethnic studies in general, and the second is the legislation in California and for high school graduation.
Right.
Let me take the first one first, because in many ways, what you find is that there are different definitions of ethnic studies. And so while San Francisco State can claim a 50-year anniversary of ethnic studies, was really the 50th year anniversary of the Third World Strike at San Francisco state, out of which for the campus, several ethnic studies programs were initiated in African American studies, La Raza studies, Asian American studies, and to some extent, maybe not immediately, but American Indian studies. In many ways, it was a significant event for San Francisco State and for particularly Asian American studies, but not so much for Chicana and Chicano studies and African American studies. And the reason I say that, and American Indian studies, the reason I say that is because those particular disciplines, now I call them disciplines, then I call them areas of study, have a slightly earlier and different origin story. And those origin stories are tied to both social movements like the Chicano movement, as well as the development of segregated public schooling, which started in earnest in the early 20th century after the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson, which allowed for constitutionally available separation of races. And so we developed public schooling for whites and public schooling, if you will, for blacks as two separate institutions and in this country. And so the idea of the curriculum content as it related to the language issues that we were talking about earlier were mixed up in the movement for a new nationalism that was taking place in that turn of the century, that came out of the Civil War and what is some historians call the second founding of the country, where there is more of a focus on a common national identity and character, and that is centered around the English language and the development of public schooling then, which makes English the universal language of instruction legally across the country through state legislation at different times over the late 19th and early 20th century. And so the idea was not only just language shift, it was also to Americanize new immigrants, annexed populations like Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, and indigenous populations. The boarding schools that were set up by the federal government in the late 19th century had as well English as the language of instruction, and a prohibition and punishment and penalties for the use, even if it's informal use, of indigenous languages in those schools. And so the policies are both linguistic, but they're also cultural, going back in through the history of the country. So that when we get to development of ethnic studies, it's really as a result of the first wave of dealing with the curriculum that is standardized in that segregated system after 1954, where desegregation is supposed to take place. And so a lot of Black teachers and Black superintendents and administrators of the Black school systems are basically let go. And where there is integration of any kind, it's primarily the standardization of the white English dominant curriculum and perspective that wins over. And so in the 50s and 60s, part of the resistance, if you will, in the Black social movement, and particularly amongst leaders in Black schooling and education was to maintain that part of the history of Blacks in the U.S. In as part of the curriculum. And so there was if you will, an ethnic studies movement in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that was sometimes called multicultural education, sometimes called ethnic studies, sometimes called Black studies. And so the development of ethnic studies kind of took different routes for different groups. For Chicanos and Chicanas, primarily, it was the result of the political and ideological narratives that come out of the Chicana and Chicano movement, which not only was a rejection of the Anglo and Eurocentric curriculum, but was also promoting una perspectiva chicana about how we looked at our history, who we were, and all kinds of other things. So the development of Chicana and Chicano studies within that social movement was in effect part of the motivation for the Third World Strike at San Francisco State. And so it wasn't the origin of ethnic studies. It was really the, if you will, part of the higher ed rebirth of a movement to transform the curriculum from an Eurocentric white perspective to be multiple perspectives, not only on race but language and ethnicity.
It's interesting because while there's been all this squashing down, rejection of, etc., ketchup was surpassed in the last century by salsa as the most favorite condiment for foods. And the love of Mexican food and music has just blossomed, in recent decades. It's amazing how much, and then if you look at what's going on today with the ICE raids and all the prejudice against the not only migrants, but those that are here legally, and the people in the communities surrounding them are coming out in major protest because we're beloved. We are contributing. We're hardworking. We formed there's a lot of history I'm not going to throw in here, but we've been the basis of the military in Vietnam. That's why we had the Chicano moratorium. We were 25% of the war dead when we were 4% of the population. And now the same thing, the numbers are up there very high. And we are the contributors. We are the builders of wealth in the state of California and everywhere else that you have Latino people working and studying and living. It's a real disconnect in our culture that we don't understand. And the other thing is the idea that we're a totally impoverished population is ridiculous because we're nearly a $3 trillion economic market in this country. That's about the size of the country of France. So, there are all these disconnects. And on the whole, students now that are attending, Chicano studies, ethnic studies, Chicano studies classes, what are they excited about today when they have, when they're engaged in any kind of historic discourse?
Well, let me answer that by describing some of the changes that have taken place in Chicana and Chicano studies over the last 50 plus years now. Almost 60 years coming this new year. There in trying to Juan Gomez Quinones, who was a historian, died in 2020, good friend of ours, has written on the history of development of Chicana and Chicano studies. And he kind of initially, a long time ago, said that the first 10 years of Chicana and Chicano studies were really discovery years. Not only what is seeking what la perspectiva chicana was, but how to do it. And so we can't say that Chicana and Chicano studies developed as a whole person, as a whole discipline. It really was a matter of seeking out methodologies, ideas, concepts, and even novel theories that would better explain what's happened to us over a long period of years. And so in some ways, there are three broad questions that are grand questions, if you will, that have driven the discipline over 50 plus years. One, who are we? Two, what's our material condition in the world? And three, what do we do about it? And to some extent, those are not the kinds of questions that are developed for other disciplines or even for other ways of looking at Mexicans in the U.S. Okay, so we can distinguish Chicano studies con la perspectiva chicana from what I've been calling for a couple of decades now, Chicanology. That is just the study of Chicanos. And particularly when most of the people have been trained with PhDs in disciplines that are Eurocentric in U.S. Academy. And so development of la perspectiva chicana becomes very difficult. If we go back to the kind of research, scholarship, and creative works that have been under the rubric of Chicana and Chicano studies, we find that there are four necessary dimensions of Chicana and Chicano studies research: history, context, power, and indigeneity. Or to say it another word, if you're going to do Chicana and Chicano studies, it has to be historicized, it has to be politicized, it has to be contextualized, and it has to be indigenized. But in addition to that, we also have to deal with four of the big ideas that currently help organize U.S. society and in many ways Western civilization, let's say, but particularly in the U.S. Those four big ideas are race, racism, and racial formation. Two, class and social control, class and political economy, rather. Three, sex, gender, and sexuality. And four, culture and social control or social organization. And with those four big ideas, you're going to be getting, with the four necessary dimensions, a different sense of what La Perspectiva Chicana is all about. And it doesn't mean that there's just one. It just means that from the point of view of the scholar and the discipline, these are the options and these are the views that can be expected. Along with that has been a better definition of the subject matters of Chicana and Chicano studies. There's a whole set of debates under identity studies about, are we talking about Mexicans born in the U.S. or Mexicans that speak Spanish, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Who are the Mexicans? And even they can't, even we can't decide who should be studied. And therefore, it really isn't a discipline of itself. Well, in this work that has taken place over the years, there's been a kind of a redefined subject matter area that takes into account a longer historical dimension, as much as 6,000 years, and two, one that is based in these continents and rooted in indigeneity. Let me give you a quick statement of how it's been summarized. The elaborated subject matter of the discipline can be stated as the study of Mexican Chicano people of the northern continent of Abya Yala, in its multiple subjectivities and diversities, Indo, Mestizo, Mulatto, Hispano, primarily of Mexican origin, the tap root of which is indigenous within the 6,000-year-old Toltecoyotl, Mexicoyotl cultural area of Anahuac and Aztlán. That's a mouthful.
Yes.
And it's not necessarily the immediate or surface concept of Mexican national origin or national identity, even if it's cultural nationalism. But it is one that comes out of the particular notion of the study of Mexicans on this continent. And by Mexicans, I'm referring to it as, if you will, a small m, but as a cultural area, not political units like nation states or counties or that kind of thing. And so the geocultural area of what is now the Southwest U.S. and the Mexican nation bring together Aztlán, the origin of the 7 tribes that go from Aztlán to Mexico, the Valley of Mexico, and where one of them establishes Tenochtitlan, that becomes the capital of a triple alliance for what is called the Mexican or Aztec, quote, empire, which is really a network of city-states. And so you see a much different kind of, if you will, perspective of the population by the changes that have taken place in all this research over 50 years that require a different subject matter statement so that it fits within the paradigm shift that Chicana and Chicano studies represents.
Well, it's a fascinating world of study and engagement. I love history. I mean, I was a Danforth Foundation Fellow in U.S. history, but I took a couple of classes with Juan Gomez Quinones, and we turned out to be compadres, and our fathers grew up together in Hidalgo de Parral, Chihuahua. So there's a piece of history, which is, relative. I only found that out when I was at UCLA. But to get back to this idea of language and linguistics, and talk about the power of language, how do we, through our understanding of linguistics and through our educational systems, whether it's in Chicano studies or elsewhere, how do we develop that sense of historic awareness of history so that we don't have to keep repeating it and making the same mistakes as what I was always taught in every single one of my history classes? We have to learn from history. And how do we use language in a way that is constructive and uplifting and empowering, teaching the truth about history, like the fact that, California is a progressive state because of the Mexicana Californios who refused to allow the Eastern people that came out to transfer power from Mexico to the United States after the War of 1846, 1848, refused to allow slavery. So this could not become a slave state. And that's one of the reasons that we're different than Texas, which did become a slave state. So, there are all these political
part of
things.
the Confederacy.
How do we use the language and the frameworks to empower understanding of the facts of history and the contributions of Latinos, Latinas, and Mexicanos and all the different groups that are part of who we are? How do we empower them so that we have a history that shares our contributions and empowers us at the same time, and also would empower everybody else? There would not be the hate and all the time wasted on book banning and everything else that's going on today.
Yeah. Well, that question brings us back to ethnic studies.
Yeah.
And to the extent that that bilingual education and ethnic studies have sort of diverged from the 60s because of the way the legislation developed for each. They really need to be put back together. And so from the beginning in the Chicano movement, we were talking about bilingual Chicana and Chicano studies and bilingual Chicana and Chicano schooling. So, and by bilingual, I don't just mean English and Spanish. I include in that all of the languages of that 6,000-year-old historical suite of the, if you will, Chicano or Mexican, Mexicoyotl cultural people. Nahuatl is still the largest indigenous language in Mexico. It is, and there are more than 10% of the national population in Mexico that is speaks indigenous languages. Many of them are bilingual in the indigenous language and Spanish. But in 2000, Mexico changed its constitution to include all of the indigenous languages within the Mexican national territory as national languages, official languages, equal to Spanish. And so there has been a whole wave of educational and other kinds of language policies adopted by Mexico that support not only the use, but the bilingual institutional creation of bilingual institutions like higher ed in indigenous languages and Spanish. There's still foreign language education in Mexico in English and French and other languages. But in doing that, with the migration of more and more people from Mexico to the U.S., we're finding communities of Nahuatl speakers, of Olmec speakers, of different Mayan varieties speakers here, and hometown associations and community groupings of those indigenous speakers, language speakers, that are mixed in with Spanish speakers and bilingual speakers. So, so the idea of then who are we has to include, from a language perspective, all of those kinds of issues. From an educational perspective, then what do we do in terms of either maintaining the languages, providing support or transition from those languages to Spanish and or English, but not support the notion of language shift so that they are forced to not use and thus become unable to use those languages, but also so that there is a break of this stone of monolingualism that the U.S. has imposed on its national population, so that anything that is not monolingual is in effect treacherous to the national identity. So,
well, it actually enriches the national identity. So,
yes.
so to go back
so
to
one last sentence
yes.
on that is that's why there are different definitions of ethnic studies that we have had to deal with. Some of which include Chicana and Chicanos as an object of study, like Chicanology, and some of which do and do not include Chicana and Chicano studies con la perspectiva chicana, which means that you really have to look at the ethnic studies definitions in a lot of this legislation in order to be able to determine an answer to your question.
Okay, so to go back a couple of years, when Riverside Assembly Member Jose Medina introduced a bill to require ethnic studies in order to graduate from high school, that was to be go into effect, I think 2 years ago, 2 falls ago, and it was in 23, I think. And what is the status of that? And is that a good thing for everybody? I think it is. because more people would have to know about multiculturalism, about the different groups, about common and differences, common bonds and differences. But ultimately, uh, we're one human race. That's the thing I keep getting, why are we chopping ourselves up in so many distinct pieces? We're one human race. We all have blood. We all love, breathe, and die. And we all have a creator, whatever you happen to call her, I always say, because I was taught there was a mother, father, God. But
That's
uh,
very Mexican.
it's very Mexican. Yeah, yeah. Well, I am. But
I
the
mean, indigenous Mexican.
yes, yeah, I believe very much. I'm part of Apache. I know that for a fact. I've never
Yeah.
tried to whitewash that. I love being indigenous, and European. I love having everything in me. I've got some Chino too, but the uh, the ethnic studies. I mean, I think an important measure to have passed for high school graduation. Don't I believe it is empowering for Latinos that our contributions would be shared and understood, and it also would be empowering for others because there would not be all this energy wasted on hating a group that they know very little about.
Yeah. Well, again, going back to the definition of ethnic studies. So there was a debate over the definition of ethnic studies that was developed out of the Serna legislation. And that went back through several different iterations. To the extent that it is as neutral as can be, it sort of was left to the State Board of Education to adopt a definition of ethnic studies that included each of the disciplines that covered the four major groups. And the part of the politics of it was that for Asian American studies, as Asian American studies has increased from Chinese and then Japanese and then Koreans and then Vietnamese and others in Southeast Asia, it also has moved through the Asian continent to include Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians.
Interesting.
And so part of the issue in developing course outlines for Asian American studies included lesson plans on various aspects of Palestinians, Gaza, Israeli colonial settler occupation, et cetera, et cetera. And that obviously in California, with the strong Jewish population and history that it has had, basically said, wait, stop, hold on. If you're going to do, Palestinians, then you got to do Jewish studies. So in some ways the State Board of Education punted and just said that you couldn't be one-sided, you couldn't be political, et cetera, all of the things that you could not do, along with the things that you could do given the definition of ethnic studies.
Well, yeah.
So the issue then was, you got to give time for people to develop these lesson plans that could be organized along these lines. And so there were some groups that organized around, no, ethnic studies itself is a discipline. And these are the kinds of things that we think are in that discipline. Some of the people in that group then said, if you want to study particular groups, then you have to go to other disciplines like Chicana and Chicano studies, African American studies, and so on. And so the politics over ethnic studies in California got more complicated. Now, there was a second piece of legislation that I don't know if it was sponsored by who it was sponsored by right off the top of my head, but it required an ethnic studies course in the Cal State system in order to graduate. So the idea of not only high school graduation, but Cal State CSU graduation now needed to include an ethnic studies course. For the secondary or K-12 system, they've been given almost 5 years to develop those outlines before the graduation requirement comes to play. Our current governor, because of budget concerns, pushed that back a year, if not 2 years now, because of the amount of money that he took out of the developmental process for ethnic studies courses. The CSU system had a task force of ethnic studies faculty, again, from African American studies, Chicano studies, Asian American, American Indian, and pulled together a set of guidelines for what their courses would be. And they have individual disciplinary course outlines and ethnic studies, let's say multi-ethnic studies or comparative ethnic studies outlines. So now each campus can offer as many of the courses that they have developed over the last 50 years in order to satisfy that CSU graduation requirement. So we are already engaged in doing that. And since most of our teachers come out of the CSU system, we can say that there's having some effect on public school teachers. The UC system, which has a charter that is segregated from let's say state interference or legislation, has been asked to develop criteria that includes ethnic studies for admission, but they have refused to do so. The UC system has refused to do so. And while all general campuses have some requirement, let's call it a diversity requirement for graduation, it is not always ethnic studies. Ethnic studies will satisfy the diversity requirement for graduation, but not all diversity courses are ethnic studies. So you could get away without doing ethnic studies.
Perhaps we should go back to Muslim rule in Spain, which was 6 centuries, and the three cultures, the Muslims, the Jews, and the Christians, were relatively peaceful. A lot of integration of one group into the other, if you look at world history. And they arrived at the golden age of Spain together and preserved the ancient Greco-Roman cultures and histories. So I find it fascinating that we've learned a great deal from that blend of Muslim, Spanish, Jewish cultures centuries ago, from the 790 or something to the King and Queen of Spain, the Catholic King and Queen of Spain that started the Inquisition. It's we chop up too much, we divide too much, and there's more in common. I know when I was living in New Mexico, we did a lot of study between the influence of the Arabic Muslim culture on Spain and on the Americas because of that influx of multiple cultures into the Americas. It's there's so much more we have to study and learn, and I think that it's empowering to know these things. And I'm hoping, do you have confidence that we'll be able to move forward so that we can have a history and ethnic studies that is more empowering, not only to Latinos, but to everyone, for giving them a look at how the world really is and how we can all share and participate in it in a more harmonious way?
Well, the answer to that question, I think, is the same one that it was in '68.
Yeah.
It's a struggle.
Yes.
And with the kind of anti-ethnic studies, anti-diversity, anti-LGBT legislation that is in Florida and Texas and halfway through most of the states in the country, it's not something that is a given. I think we're lulled for a good 30 years that the successes we had in the 60s and 70s that made it more comfortable for us in the 80s and 90s and even into the 21st century really are being challenged now.
Yes.
You know, it's not just Roe, it's a whole set of other things. So when there are right wingers, fascists, or just good old plain quote conservatives or religious nationalists, Christian religious nationalists, say that we should make the U.S. great again. Their version of great is the hegemony of Euro-Anglo Americanism, English national identity
Add
for
Hitler.
everybody. And if you don't fit that, then out you go, or you become placed in the social structure in a way that gives you no influence. So this debate right now about whether or not demonstrations and rallies and so on are really mob rule versus constitutionally protected free speech and redress of government is our revolution, if you will. And it's important to recognize that, excuse me, my diabetic
Monitor.
monitor. It's important to recognize that the idea of social organization along racial, cultural, linguistic, gendered lines and class lines is not it's not a given. It's dynamic, and for as long as things stay the same, there are things that are changing, and for as much as things are changing, there are things that remain the same. And we just have to be much more cognizant of that, and try and strike the same direction that we did back 50 years ago. Now, at this point, things are very different. You're right. We can talk about many of these things much more openly, even though we get grief when we do. But there are also many more ideas about and examples of what can be done so that we can reconceptualize what the nation is about and redefine e pluribus unum in a political sense without having to define it in a cultural sense or a linguistic sense, where it's not different into one, or many into one. But the old doctrine of discovery, English settler colonial notion that if you are like us, then if you're either for us or you're against us, and if you're like us, then you're for us. If you're not like us, you're against us. And that was encapsulated in the judiciary in 1832 in a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court with regards to American Indians. And it has been the basis of much of the work done after the Civil War, when the radical Reconstructionist Republicans wanted, in effect, to have a single national profile. And that included economy and political structure. And it then went to cultural. And the schools were specifically directed to be the principal tool for that.
I would imagine so, because education is very important, and we do need to be empowered through our learning of it, I believe. The preamble is also a vision, a dream, an ideal, an intention, we hold these truths, they spell them out in order to arrive at a more perfect union. So we're a process, and I think we need to look at that intention, that dream that I would call it a spiritually affirmative prayer in order to manifest it, because we can arrive at that, and we need to let go of the binary thinking. It isn't either or. Life is more like a Ferris wheel that goes up and down and swings back and forth and comes around again. And we can navigate it, but we've got to get away from the binary thinking. And I think we need to really meditate on and try to bring in the reality of those words in our preamble in order to keep our, to keep our nation and to keep our democracy, most importantly, and to have this idea of a real shared America, which is really the greater vision, I think, that includes all these indigenous peoples of all colors and countries. And it's exciting to think about that possibility. I want to thank you so much, Reynaldo, for being with us today. We're going to have much food for thought and listening and re-listening to your words. And I thank you for joining me. And to the audience, be sure you tune in next month. We have a related guest. It's part 2 of my interview with Carter Hayward, the author of 7 Deadly Sins. And she's talking more about what Professor Macias just raised about Christian nationalism. She's using the term Christo-fascism. So she'll be with us in our February edition. I want to thank you very much for joining me. Stay alert, focused, and work hard at keeping us going as we are as a democracy in its highest sense. Thank you for joining me. I'm Yolanda Nava.
Well, it was good to see you again, Yolanda. Take care.
Thank you.